And we're kicking things off today by looking at the role of trade in strengthening the U.S. economy and American jobs. We have a panel that brings a diverse set of perspectives. Orit Frenkel, the CEO of the American Leadership Initiative, Ed Gresser, Vice President and Director for Trade and Global Markets at the Progressive Policy Institute, and a member of WITC's Board of Directors, Jeff Kucik, Associate Professor at the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona, and Chad Thompson, Executive Director for Legal Affairs and Trade at General Motors, who is also one of our conference sponsors. Thanks, Chad. And of course, our moderator, my good friend, Sarah Thorn, Senior Director for Global Government Affairs at Walmart and a member of WITC's Board of Directors. As a reminder for this panel and all our panels today, if you have questions, please use the Q&A tab and we'll try to get to some of them toward the latter part of today's session. Sarah?
Thanks so much, Ken, and thank you everybody for joining us. I am delighted to moderate this panel today because this is a topic we've been thinking about a lot. How does trade policy strengthen the US economy and contribute to jobs, or does it? I think for the last number of years, we've seen a massive rethink about trade policy. So does trade policy, some of the studies say 1 in 5 jobs are linked through trade. 40 million US American jobs. Other studies say, no, imports, trade deficits destroy jobs. Some people say that's both is true, and therefore we need to rethink what we're doing for workers and what kind of approach we have to support workers through training and through opportunities. And yet others say we're missing the point entirely because the US economy has shifted. We're thinking about manufacturing, and yet the majority of the economy is services, and digital trade should make us think again about how we respond to trade policy and what are the tools of trade to support American competitiveness as we transition to a more digital economy. These are all questions I hope we can discuss today. I hope we can dig in and think about, after a time of for me, pretty radical disruption in trade policy, what do we need to do now to regroup, to rethink, and to get to that place where we can say collectively, we have a trade policy that contributes to competitiveness, that strengthens all US jobs, and hopefully is set for the future in the nature and the way the economy is going. Now, I'm glad I don't have to answer all these questions. We have a great panel to do that Ken has introduced you to them. And so I'm not going to introduce them again. We're going to dig right in. We're going to start with our friend, Ed Gresser. And I'm going to give the question to you, Ed. From your perspective, how does trade policy contribute to American jobs and competitiveness, or does it? And then we'll have everybody answer an opening question, and then we'll dig into hopefully a more constructive dialogue. And then don't forget to put your questions in the chat. Thanks. Ed.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Ken, and thanks to WITC for putting on this great show. It's a great event. I'm happy to be part of it. Just as an opening note on this, it's a great time to be thinking about jobs and competitiveness because the economy is doing quite well. Those are good times to think about long-term questions. We've had 6 million net new jobs since a year ago. We've had 76 million new hires. That's a record for as long as BLS has been keeping hiring and layoff records. And we had a record low number of layoffs last year, 3 million below the last record from 21 to 18 million. Wages are up. So the workers are doing quite well this year. How do you keep that going, and what can trade policy contribute to it? Let me say a couple of things. In order to succeed in trade, you need to export, you need to have an efficient production system, you need to have import policies that encourage high living standards and so on and so forth, and think about jobs in logistics and jobs in design and retailing, as well as jobs in the industrial side. But you do need to think about jobs in the industrial side and incomes on the agricultural side as well. Trade this year, along with the economy, has done quite well. We've had a big jump in exports of about $350 billion. We've had an even bigger jump in imports of about $500 billion. A lot of this is going to be consumer driven and reflecting both stimulus here and abroad and the tentative recovery from COVID. But I think there are a couple of things to think about on both sides. One is, over the past 4 years, we've had an experiment in tariff policy. the 232 and 301 tariffs have about roughly doubled the size of the tariff system from $40 billion a year to $85 billion a year, and from 1.4% of imports to 3% or so. If you look at this, how this works, it has changed the tariff system in two ways. One is to increase the size of the tariff system overall. The other is to shift it from a permanent system, which is mainly a way to tax retailers and families, into a mix of this with 302 and 301 tariffs, which are mainly tariffs or taxes on manufacturers and construction firms. If you look at the types of things that have come under these tariffs, they're metals. Those are obviously big construction and automaker and machinery products. There are components of high-tech goods like speaker box assemblies, printed circuits, power cords, and so forth. There are capital equipment tariffs and testing and measuring equipment, electroplating and electromechanical machinery, conveyor machines, and so on and so forth. I'm still working through this, but it looks like manufacturers are probably paying 40% of the additional tariffs, construction firms maybe 10 or 15%, families maybe 20%. So this has been a significant new financial hit on the industrial side of the economy, as well as an effort to protect it. And we have to think through how coherent is that and what can be done. I think if we are looking for a more competitive and more resilient industrial sector, we should start with the renewal of the exclusion process for the 301 tariffs, and then think through where are these hitting the industrial side of the economy particularly hard, and how do we work through it? Second side is the export economy. We have, as I mentioned, very strong growth, kind of a jobs boom. At some point, we should be shifting towards a more export-driven and more less stimulus-driven growth pattern, because everyone is debating inflation and what can be done about that. One of the cures to that is exporting. The export share of GDP last year was 10.8%. Setting aside the COVID year, that was the lowest export share of GDP since 2006. So we should be thinking about how can we do a bit more and a bit better. I think the administration has done a lot of good work and probably isn't getting all the credit it should for re-engaging with Europe, with the WTO, trying to work through some of the problems with Japan and the UK left over in the last administration. But we will need, I think, a more ambitious negotiating agenda, thinking about two problems in particular, maybe. One is that with the implementation of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement in Asia, a lot of US manufacturers and ag producers will be facing a deteriorating tariff situation where we're more and more at a disadvantage relative to China, to Japan, to Australia, other competitors. We have similar challenges in quite rapidly developing sub-Saharan African economy. Then on the other side, as you mentioned, Sarah, the digital area is really an area we have tremendous opportunities, both in creating digital industry related jobs here and in exporting services like healthcare, like education, like entertainment. And the internet is evolving in lots of ways, but one way is towards more and more restrictions and more nationalistic policies. And we should be quite engaged in trying to fend that off and trying to develop consensus on appropriate regulations that will protect consumers, protect people against cyber theft and so forth, but also keep markets open to our legitimate and very high quality products. So that would be my quick answer.
Thanks so much. Fascinating about the tariffs on manufactured goods. Jeff, interested in hearing your perspective, and feel free to respond to Ed's positing about the impact of tariffs on manufacturing and the 301 tariffs as well.
Sure, just on that point, Sarah, and thanks again to everyone for having me. One thing that I think is going to be an important priority moving forward is thinking about trade volatility, not just traditional stories about import penetration. So many of the arguments over free trade are about how if we buy stuff from abroad, we're producing less of it at home, and that crowds out local employment, right? And so rhetoric around the trade deficit, is all about this, right? That we're losing jobs when we're consuming so much from other markets in the global economy. But volatility, I think, is especially important. And it's not just a story about COVID. We've seen how the pandemic shocked global markets in a variety of ways. But even before that, 70% of the counties in America with the slowest job growth, or indeed the ones that lost jobs over the last decade since the Great Recession, were all exposed to above average trade volatility. So that could mean two things. One, it could be a traditional import shock, like the China shock we hear so much about, or it could be an export shock, like we see in the US-China trade war, when exporters like our soybean farmers are exposed to retaliatory barriers abroad, then their market access is suddenly cut off. So I would just want to stress that point, add that to the story about imports versus exports, the traditional rhetoric around import penetration and competing with buying stuff from abroad. Because as you've already mentioned, we know that imports support lots of jobs in America. We know that there are a variety of industries that thrive on imports. So the story is not just about how much we're consuming from abroad in terms of levels, but how stable and consistent are those trade relationships around the world over time. And we see increasingly where there's volatility, workers are hurt. And then just to mention a couple of other things briefly by way of getting us started. I think one of the real benefits of the current administration is this growing recognition that a kind of a two-tier approach to these issues is required. So what I mean by that is there's kind of a traditional, kind of outward-looking international trade policy element to this, and then there's growing recognition that we need domestic initiatives that complement our trade policies. So when we're thinking about kind of the rules of the game and what those global policies look like, I think there are some interesting legal challenges ahead of us. So we've seen folks argue for dismantling some of our trade agreements, reforming some of our trade agreements. What are we going to do about the World Trade Organization and its rule set? Well, many of the reform proposals out there for a more worker-centric trade policy, and especially a more worker-centric international trade body of law, call for greater flexibility in the rules. The logic is that you allow domestic governments to protect their workers during hard times. That's going to better enable them to comply with the global trade regime generally, and it's going to benefit those domestic firms who are suffering during market shocks or whatever the conditions might be. We kind of get that logic intuitively, but one of the problems with greater flexibility is, of course, that we already know trade remedies use is controversial. Almost a full quarter of all international trade disputes at the WTO are just about anti-dumping specifically. So I think if we're considering what international trade law looks like moving forward, and we want greater flexibility for governments to protect their workers and their local firms, we've got a delicate balance on our hands between how much flexibility do you afford and how much do you open yourself up to the kind of legal morass associated with potential abuse of the system. So that's kind of a story about abroad. And then at home, just very briefly, I would say we hear a lot about America lagging behind, labor shortages in this country, lack of competitiveness. And I think we've got to take seriously some of these proposed investments in domestic infrastructure. And perhaps you would expect me to say what I'm about to say, but I think education also matters. And it took us 10 years after the Great Recession for public education expenditures per student, 10 years to return to pre-Great Recession levels. So we're on the right track now, but that's just my pitch for if we're concerned about global competitiveness, domestic infrastructure projects, education spending, maybe even thinking about expanding things like TAA. We need to complement those global policies with domestic work as well.
Thanks, Jeff. Chad, you're right there. You're a GM as a manufacturer, but also a service company and moving into sort of next generation autos. How would you respond to this big, broad question about jobs and the impact of trade policy?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think part of my job on the panel is to provide a counterpoint to the other panelists, but I actually agree with most of what Ed and Jeff are saying. I mean, I think they make really good points. From a practical manufacturing perspective, trade is incredibly important, and it factors in the decisions we're making every day, both on the input side and the output side. On the input side, when we decide what countries to source what products and raw materials from, when we look at both availability and supply chain resilience and the price that we're paying for those inputs. And all that impacts the competitiveness of our products and the number of people we can employ. On the output side, trade's incredibly important for a number of reasons, one being scale. So for example, when we look at a new vehicle that we're thinking about bringing to market, we take a look at how many do we think we can sell, how much is it going to cost to do the research and development, to do the engineering, to actually install the production capacity. And if you have just the domestic market, it's harder to justify some of those expenditures. But if you have export opportunities, then and the ability to spread those costs out over more vehicles, then it makes the the business case more attractive. And in the same way, once you decide to build a vehicle, we have to determine how many we want to make, where we want to make them, and trade policy is a really important part of that, and that can impact the number of jobs that we have in a plant, the number of shifts that we run, the number of jobs that our suppliers that are in large part located around the plant, how many they employ. And so trade is incredibly important for us and for other manufacturers. And I think one thing that a point that Ed made that is incredibly important is, as we consider where to go from here on trade policy, we need to keep domestic manufacturers in mind and make sure that they're not put at a competitive disadvantage to our foreign counterparts, both here in the domestic market and in export markets.
Thanks so much. Orit, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about transition to digital and how we think about that from a worker-centric perspective. Let's go to you, and then let's try to weave some of these threads together and some additional.
Of course, I'm muted. First, I just thought I'd give a broad response to a couple of the comments that were made. I think there's no question that trade has been beneficial, but I don't think we've really reckoned with the fact that, there have been major dislocations and negative impacts. And I don't think that that's really been adequately reckoned with. And I think it's one of the reasons that politically, you've seen both, certainly we saw in the 2016 election, both Democrats and Republicans running away from trade. So I think it's kind of, we just can't keep talking about it in the same way. I think that there's a pretty broad recognition that Trumpism clearly wasn't the right way, but I think there's also a feeling that the policies in the decades before that weren't the right way. We don't have adequate social supports, and we weren't really taking care of the people left behind. Trade adjustment assistance is inadequate, and we didn't provide enough social supports. And we didn't build into our trade agreements adequate disciplines to deal with China, subsidies and other things like that. So, part of the reason actually that I and a few others started the American Leadership Initiative was the thought that, we need to think about trade in a different way. We just can't keep thinking about it in the same rubric. So I think, from that notion, we go to, what is a worker-centric trade policy? And in my mind, and then I could talk a bit about digital and get more into that in the conversation, but I think it was Jeff who made the comment that I agree with, that, the first part of this is that, the bright line that we used to have or think about with regard to domestic and international policies no longer exists. We really can't kind of think about it in the same way. And in my mind, a worker-centric trade policy, and certainly a worker-centric digital policy, starts at home. If we look at digital, and the reason I'm focusing at the moment on digital is because, Obviously there's just been such a dramatic increase in digital technologies, even for manufacturing, for almost everything that we do. And the first step is really to address the digital divide at home, which drives huge economic equality. And a lot of that is also, it's not just, it's also particularly vis-a-vis underserved communities. There's a sharper digital divide for low-income people, for African Americans, for women, for rural Americans, for Native Americans, disabled Americans, Hispanic, you go on the line. So we need to really make sure that there's access for all those underserved communities. We need to update trade adjustment assistance. And we need to, accelerate the ability for small businesses to access global networks. That's something that also we haven't focused on. I think trade policy has really been focused on large companies, and small businesses need a lot of attention so that they can access globally. And really in the US, half of the private sector workforce, 60 million employees last year, worked for small companies. So it's a very significant economic driver.
Or do you think you've gone on mute again?
Oh, I thought it was me.
Oh, have I?
Now I can hear you. Thanks.
Oh, I don't know how long I've been on mute.
Just a few seconds.
Few seconds. Okay, so I just said I could talk about global, what I would want to see in a worker-centric digital agreement, but why don't I take a pause and open up for conversation, and we can come back to some.
So this is great. We've had sort of a broad perspective here, which says, one, we've got to look at volatility and shocks. Two, we need to think about the impacts of policies that seem like they would be addressing state-sponsored actors like tariffs, but what are the ultimate impacts of those? And, third, how do we think about digitization in terms of managing inequality? So I have a couple of sort of provocative follow-up questions that anybody just raise your hand and jump in. One, we talk a lot about the digital agenda, but as Orit, as you suggest, if we pursue sort of a digital trade agreements, does that actually lead to additional inequality? I think one of the big challenges that we've had with trade policy is this sense that it only benefits big companies. And how do we reconcile this idea that that it's, because we're a little bit afraid of market access and manufacturing and the impact, we're just going to focus on a digital agenda. But could that actually lead to more inequality because we've not addressed these fundamental competitiveness issues? That's one question. The second question I have is, if we don't address the people who aren't playing by the rules, is it possible to actually create more rules? Should we be entering into new agreements if in the past the biggest actors haven't actually paid, haven't actually lived up to their obligations? And in fact, some could say that in the US has actually sort of not in the last several years been living up to the spirit of, I would say, the commitments that we've made in terms of multilateralism. So I don't know who wants to jump in on any of those questions. I was thinking Jeff's come off mute, so we'll throw it to you first, and then hopefully you'll be provocative and everybody will want to jump in.
Well, maybe, but yeah, just a quick follow-up on that, especially on this point about inequality, which is a word that I'm glad came up. I mean, one of the things we have to do if we're thinking about digital or any other sector of the economy is think about the kind of jobs we're creating or the quality of those jobs, right? So one of the difficulties in thinking about kind of big picture arguments, is trade good or bad for America, is that there's competing statistics. We can say, the US lost 30% of its manufacturing jobs between the year 2000 through the end of the Great Recession. Or we can say after the Great Recession, there was a full decade of uninterrupted positive jobs reports. And for every manufacturing job we lost, we added 4 jobs in the service sector. Now, all of those things are strictly true, but does it tell us anything about the quality of the jobs we're creating, the quality of the jobs we're losing, and the effect on inequality, as Orit just mentioned, that I think we should take really seriously? So it turns out that the fastest growing segments of the labor force are not Silicon Valley and Wall Street, which we might think would be good news, but it's still leisure and hospitality, it's still retail trade. Those are America's two biggest employers, and they're the two lowest paid industries on average in non-farm employment. So my point is only to say, yes, inequality is a problem. It's worth taking seriously. I think we all get that. But if we're thinking about job creation, and especially if we're thinking about prioritizing digital, which I do believe makes sense, then we want to keep an eye on, who's enfranchised here, who has access to these jobs or careers, and what does it really mean for the thinness or thickness of individuals' wallets. So I think maybe not so controversial on that, because everybody would presumably agree with at least some portion of that, but just to say, yes, I think inequality is worth keeping in the conversation.
So I just wanted to jump in for a second and address Sarah's question on could a digital trade agreement lead to greater inequality? I mean, I think one thing we've learned a lot is how to frame an agreement so that doesn't happen. And I think we've done a lot of work on what a worker-centric digital agreement would look like. And there's some, also good samples out there. I mean, if you look at DIPA, the digital agreement between Chile, Singapore, and New Zealand, it has in it a module that talks about access and inclusion, and countries commit to closing their digital divides, particularly with underserved communities. It has a module on facilitating trade for small businesses. I would go further in an agreement and talk about a digital agreement. I mean, to your point, one of the big jobs that's come up on the digital, since we've had digital technologies, is gig workers or platform workers. And I think an agreement should have a provision saying that the countries want to work together to create, and it's a global problem, not just a US problem, to create social, talk about how to address gig workers, creating social safety nets. So I think there's a lot of things you can put in an agreement that really can try to address some of these inequalities.
I'm going to jump in. It looks like Sarah had a little issue with her Zoom link. We've seen a couple of those this morning, so apologies on that. Ed, it looks like you were ready to jump in. Did you want to jump in on that thread? And we also probably follow up a little bit more on some of the tariff and tariff exclusion issues that have come up in recent years.
Okay, let me stick with this theme for a minute for a second. I think all of us who are engaged in trade policy in Washington in various ways, as analysts or in government or in business, want to be confident that what we're doing is important and relevant. And I very much believe that it is, but it isn't the only thing in the world. And we have to be aware that if you're talking about the digital economy, it is growing and expanding very much because companies are deploying more and more fiber optic cable, and manufacturing and agricultural trade grow because the container shipping world and the roll-on roll-off fleet and the maritime airports get more and more efficient. So it is quite hard to fix a problem that's, even if it were rightly assumed to come from trade growth, strictly through agreements and policy that with other governments. The core issue that I think Jeff and Orit both pointed to is what sort of supports through domestic policy do workers need, do families need? How do you get a consensus for the right approaches to healthcare, to job search and job placement assistance? How much of that comes from the government versus how much from companies and unions? And whatever we're doing through agreements is a complement to those more fundamental domestic policies. If what we're talking about is confidence of a worker in a factory, in a restaurant, in a gas station, wherever, that if I lose my job, I'll have something okay to fall back on and some new options to turn to. And I think that's really the core of it. And trade policy may help, but if we're relying on trade policy to be the main response, I do not think it will pan out.
Chad, it looks like you're ready to jump in.
Yeah, I'll jump in briefly on the digital piece. So backing up to some of the earlier comments on domestic policy, incredibly important, and we think the administration is doing some great things to promote electric vehicle adoption and supply chain and production here. And some of you may have seen last week we announced a new $7 billion investment in Michigan, much of that to produce batteries and electric vehicles here. And there's a digital piece to that. As vehicles get more and more advanced, and there's going to be more software defined, there's going to be reliance on more data, whether it's to map and provide semi-autonomous features for your vehicle, or just to provide entertainment and software in the vehicle. And so one of the things that we hope that a digital agreement would accomplish is allow us to deploy a lot of those same features for the exports that we build in the US and send to other countries. We have a hard enough time now just doing different seatbelt harnesses and mirrors for different countries. If there's a separate software solution or separate data localization requirements for each of the countries we want to sell vehicles, that makes it harder for our US produced stuff to be competitive. So the digital piece, very important.
And we had a question that came in that stays in this theme, asking about the impact of digitization on the economic activities of digital areas. How can our trade policies help enhance access for digital to other underserved communities?
I think, Ken, I think the question is regarding developing countries. Digitization in developing countries.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because, if you look at groups that work to aid, like sub-Saharan Africa and the poorest places in the world, they will tell you that the single best thing you could give a woman entrepreneur to speed development is a cell phone, a smartphone. If you give, a female, and most of these, small business entrepreneurs in the deep developing world are women, smartphone gives you access to banking, gives you access to the economy, allows you to sell your goods, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously it's more complicated than that. And we need, developing countries have a digital divide just like we do, et cetera. But digitization and the availability of technologies can actually be a big boon to even the poorest countries.
I see Ken stepped in for me, which was great when my computer decided to shut down automatically. So I appreciate, I guess we've moved on to digital, and not to jump around too much, but the one other area I wanted to talk about was TAA and adjustment, and how we were thinking about that, and how do we adjust, and how do, is adjusting after the fact appropriate, or should we be pre-adjusting and be pre-competitive? And I wonder if anybody has thoughts on that. And I think one of the things I've always thought about trade adjustment assistance is if you've already lost your job and then you label it because of trade, does that actually contribute to this sense that trade destroys jobs? And are we actually then training for the jobs of the future? Or how are we thinking about how we link that type of training to where the jobs are going to be as opposed to where they might have been in the past? Don't know if anybody has thoughts on that.
Well, I just want to chime in with something related to this. Sorry, Sarah, if it's not a direct answer to what you're asking, but there have been a couple of mentions so far about, are existing trade rules good, but they're just weakly enforced, or do we need new trade rules? But I think, as Orit pointed out correctly, trade law probably lags desperately behind in certain sectors of the economy, including digital. So I would just stress that we do have a real opportunity now to think about what international trade rules look like moving forward, because they're just not there at all in a lot of existing agreements. And so some of these ideas about, what some of the international trade law folks would call socially inclusive trade rules or a worker-centered trade policy, we have a real opportunity for, I wouldn't even call it reform right now, but rule creation. And so that's a priority that's worth considering. Now, I know, Sarah, you had something more domestic in mind than that, but I just think the international law kind of context for this, it's kind of an open question right now, and that's potentially a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts there, Ed?
Yeah, I was going back to your question on TAA. I think there are three things come to mind. One is that most studies at most times find trade-related job loss is relatively minor compared to losses from domestic competition and recessions and so forth. And in circumstances where that remains true, TAA is, I think, it's a quite ambitious program, much more than is available to waitresses or to retail workers who lose jobs. Mark Warner, when he was governor of Virginia, had a great approach in creating kind of single points of contact for textile communities in Southern Virginia, where they were transitioning out of the apparel industry. So we'd have one state office where they had community college, the employment search, health offices, all the services you would have in one place for someone who wanted to come in, take a year and a half to train as a electrician or something like that. And I think that remains quite a good model. The really challenging one, and I don't know if it's going to come up again, is the research done on China shock, where very large country suddenly becomes very, very competitive. That rewards a lot of people and it punishes a lot of people, irrespective of what the rules are. For a long time, like miners and farmers were doing very well, energy workers were doing really well, mid-tier manufacturing workers were really struggling, and that led to situations where research would find communities that were dependent on 2 or 3 big factories would really go into depressions. And the option in those cases of training you for a new job in that area was not a good one, because ultimately those communities had fewer jobs than they had before, and the solution is a painful one to move to somewhere else where there's more jobs, rather than to stay there for 2 years and train for something that may not ever occur again. So I think that in the TAA world, there's a real distinction between the normal situation where we have some competition and job loss. It's essentially, it's frictional, sometimes localized, but you can deal with it through a program like TAA. And another one where there's a big structural change that TAA was not capable of dealing with, and might even have been in some ways a kind of perverse program.
It's interesting, Ed. It kind of ties back into Jeff's shocks, and the volatility question. So maybe we need kind of a super flexible TAA.
Sarah, I just wanted to add a couple of quick points. I mean, obviously, everyone I know agrees that optimally you'd have adjustment assistance and not trade adjustment assistance. But for a whole variety, that just isn't on the political agenda at this point. But I will say that the new the new TAA proposed by the House does include TAA for communities, which I think really addresses the point that Ed, very correctly identified. So hopefully that piece will stay in the new bill.
Yeah.
And maybe one additional thing worth pointing out about TAA is that there's some pretty compelling recent evidence about not just whether the provision of it is insufficient, but how underutilized it actually is. So part of the story might also be about promoting access to existing programs, recognizing, of course, that maybe those solutions are imperfect, but some folks who did research on the frequency with which out of work people petition for help shows that it's not that frequent.
Ed has slightly a cheeky Q&A saying, should we have TAA for people who've lost their jobs due to 301 and 201 tariffs, which, fair point, fair point. There are a couple other questions in the chat, Orit, one that's sort of directed towards you a little bit, which is, if we talk about the importance of equalizing access to ICT infrastructure, what are we doing about creating better opportunities through tariffs, through trade policy for people to have actually the tools that hopefully work when they're on Zoom calls to be able to access the internet? Thoughts on that? All right, you're on mute.
Yeah. Famous last words. I do think, we don't have a lot, there aren't a lot of tariffs on ICT products at this point. We have the ITA, which really eliminated products on those pieces of equipment. I do think, we need to ensure closing the digital divide, not just domestically, but globally. And I think, when we look at negotiating agreements, I think that's something that we have to take into consideration and can take into consideration across the board.
Yeah. And I see you're off mute. Did you have
raise one minor point of disagreement on that last one. We have, I feel right now, quite a lot of tariffs on ICT goods. That is a significant target of the 301. So we don't have
correct. Yeah, sorry, that was my, yes, you're right. We didn't have tariffs and then they were put on, right?
So Ed, just to go on, as we think about tariffs and tariff exclusions and rethinking this, you clearly have a point of view. Is there a thought about how we would manage through these 201, 301 tariffs to enhance competitiveness?
Well, I think the first step is the exclusion process. That's a clunky thing. It is individual companies petitioning saying, here's a particular product we need and we can't get. I believe there is something like 90,000 of those petitions during the last administration. That would be the first step. And the second step, I think, would be to think through what is it we want to achieve with China and where are our core priorities. The approach that the last administration chose in the what they call the phase 1 agreement, I think, was not a particularly good one. China is, a lot of it involves exporting targets. China is a big importer. They are not quite as large an importer as we are, but buy lots of ag products, buy lots of services, buy lots of manufactured goods. The problem that initiated the 301 case was a particular set of abuses, often in the digital world, often in the investment world, meant to extract technology. And you can add some other challenges. Ambassador Tais laid out some in a speech he gave at CSIS. But I think we should try to think through first, what do we want to achieve? Not feel that we're pinned to this export targeting concept. And maybe as an opening, the reason we have so many 301 tariffs is not because the 301 case imposed them all. It's because there was this following on rounds of retaliations, and you hit me and I'll hit you and then I'll hit you back. And maybe those, we can start by looking at some of those follow-on rounds that went beyond the core bounds of 301 case and see whether we can de-escalate a little bit in those areas.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm looking at the questions and shifting topics a bit. We haven't really talked about some of the challenges we've been having with supply chains that have actually also called into question, do we have the right structure for competitiveness if we're so tied to just in time? And Caitlin had a question actually about all of the challenges we're having now exporting with, goods coming in and empty containers going abroad. Do you all have any thoughts about, and this is a challenge, where are there policies that we need to implement to make sure we don't get into this situation again? And two, to facilitate those exports, which are so important for competitiveness? Or are we just have to wait till the kinks work out?
I have two ideas. One is with respect to Caitlin Siganothi's question about how do you have, when you have a situation where you have exporters with cargoes are ready to pay and ready to go, and the ocean carrier doesn't want to take them because the price for exporting a container is $3,000 and for importing one is $15,000. The House has actually passed a bill on this called the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, and sponsored by Representatives Garamendi and Dusty Johnson, which says, among other things, if there is a waiting export cargo, and it doesn't require the ship to delay, the ship has to take it. And that's sort of similar to what we do in a lot of industries, like in taxis. We don't say the taxi company can decide only to go back and forth from Mayflower to Dulles. It has to serve the neighborhoods. So that's something the House has passed pretty strongly, and I believe the administration supports it. Otherwise, the challenge is a long bit of work through the infrastructure bill to ramp up the quality of our ports and go from there. That's not something that can be done quickly. So there is going to be a lot of waiting this out and working through the kinks.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
And okay, all right. Yeah, Orit, I wanted to go ahead, and then I want to bring Chad in on this. And I know our next panel's on supply chain, so I don't want to go too down this rabbit hole, but your perspective is so interesting. Go ahead, Orit, and then
no,
Chad,
I mean, this is
love your
just a very
perspective.
tiny piece. Obviously, the supply chain issue is extremely complex, and there's so many aspects to it. But I do think a couple things quick to Ed's point on China. I mean, having good digital rules, I think, is an important way to address some of the China technology issues. And two, digitization of a lot of the customs and trade facilitation pieces will really, again, it's a piece of the supply chain. But, if you start to go with paperless invoicing, digital cut rules of origin, digital SPS certificates, you eliminate a lot of kind of the, you just make things easier and faster.
Yeah, certainly we've seen that throughout the pandemic, and we've seen it with eFIDO for sanitary and phytosanitary, where you can immediately trace back to the original certification.
And
Chad,
if you do that globally.
Yeah, thoughts on this and how you guys are managing with these disruptions? I know the chips issues and all of these challenges have been in front and center.
Yeah, not a lot to say on the export container piece, but on the, on the imports on supply chain, it's been incredibly important and a really valuable learning experience over the last year. That just in time's great, except when things don't get there on time. Don't want to steal the thunder for the next panel, but from a manufacturing perspective, resilience has become way more important than it was in the past, and is factored into a lot of our planning, and we've made public announcements on a number of the key components for electric vehicles that we're planning to localize, and all that takes time and takes investment, and in some cases you need a critical mass of other industries to make it make sense and to get the suppliers here. But I'd say especially for the must-have enterprise critical projects, resilience is priority number one. For some of the things that are maybe nice to haves, then you can still focus on efficiency. But it's become important, not just for semiconductors, but for raw materials and key components and even some of the low tech components. So it's an important part of the discussion and one of the things that we're talking about every day.
Got it. So I see we're coming a little bit up on time. I kind of wanted to ask one rounding out question in terms of, we've heard a lot about rethinking trade policy, worker-centered trade policy, but we're not negotiating in many ways new agreements. We have an idea of frameworks in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but if we're not going back to negotiating traditional trade agreements, how do you actually implement some of these ideas that we've been talking about, other than sort of investments, which are critically important in U.S. infrastructure, training, and jobs? I mean, I think it's one thing to posit this, but then how do we actually implement this? And if you had one or two recommendations for the good people at USTR and Commerce and NSC, what would it be to actually jumpstart this? And now that we've had sort of a year of reflection, to really put these thoughts into action. And I'll start with Chad, because you're on my screen.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think the focus on domestic policy, especially on the climate change space, incredibly important. And then, you know, I think that's priority 1, 2, and 3. And then 4 is supply chain. You know, working with industry and suppliers and foreign partners to help build out the you know, a resilient local and allied supply chain is incredibly important too.
Great. Orit?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the domestic piece is key, but I think there's a lot you can do globally short of a traditional trade agreement. And I know that, you know, these are some of the things that USTR is looking at, especially in their new Indo-Pacific economic framework. We can look for agreements on worker labor standards, environmental standards, look to agreements on corruption, digital standards, you know, supply chain issues, as we've talked about. So I think there's a lot that we can do that, you know, with things that aren't traditional agreements, you know, agreements to, let's say, limit subsidies for fossil fuels, you know, and a whole range of things like that we can do that are, you know, not traditional trade agreements or plurilateral and are more agreements on things, a lot of things that maybe people would even call trade adjacent issues.
Yeah.
But I think have a big impact on trade.
I hear that. I think the question where I'm struggling with is, if you have these agreements and they're binding, how are they enforceable? You know, if you don't have kind of a market access side, et cetera, and what are the tools that you need to use to think about how do you make these new agreements enforceable? I don't know, Jeff, if you have thoughts about any of it and all of that.
Well, one thing worth saying is that a lot of the folks on the academic side who are talking about what, you know, more enforceable trade agreements or what socially inclusive trade agreements might look like, so your Greg Schaefers or your Donnie Rodericks or folks like that, you know, they're not just talking about something like the controversies swirling around trade remedies. They're also including things like tax policy, which we haven't mentioned yet. There's a whole other thing we won't get into at this late stage, but you know, there's tax policies, whether that's corporate or other forms of tax policy. There are other ways to approach redistribution and to provide those social safety nets that folks on this panel have already stressed being important. So again, it's not just about, you know, what are your tariff levels or when are you allowed to use anti-dumping or not, but then this wider set of policies that might soften kind of the harsh blow of globalization, sometimes on the losers from free trade. And then just in one final breath, if I may, because I opened my comments today with talking about the importance of volatility, you know, it's just another way of advertising the importance of the next panel. Volatility is one of the #1 things that's cost jobs in this country and depressed wages. And where does volatility come from? Well, in part, it comes from not having diversified supply chains or relying too much on particular trade partners for your vital inputs. So again, just kind of lots of moving parts in that conversation, but thinking broadly about trade-related policies, then thinking about the fundamental structure of our trade relationships around the world, both important.
Great. Ed, to you for the final word.
Okay, well, a couple of things, maybe 3 things. One is, I do think ultimately we need agreements and negotiations. If it is a concern that the U.S. Manufacturing and ag will be at a tariff disadvantage in Asia Pacific and Africa, that's a concern you can't solve without some agreements. So I think that has to come. I think there are a lot of things that you can do in trade policy that aren't enforceable and aren't agreements, but are quite important. That, you know, we have lots and lots of trade and investment framework agreements and dialogues where we talk about best practices in sanitary and phytosanitary standards, and technical barriers to trade, and digital security, cybersecurity, and digital access. Those sorts of things don't need enforcement as such because they're often quite good for the countries involved. And trade facilitation is another example. And last thing I'll say is, we've had a lot of this focus on tariffs and so forth over the past 4 years. One of my concerns has always been that the American tariff system is quite antiquated and quite regressive, and we're taxing a lot of products that are not made here and only bought by poor people. And it's not a system we should be very proud of. And I would love it if we would take a bit of time to take a look at and say there's some things we should probably purge out of this without regard to what foreigners do.
Got it. Thank you so much. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I don't know if Ken is still on, if he wants to jump on just for the final word. If not, I did want to thank our panelists so much for their thoughtful and insightful comments today on a pretty broad topic. Hopefully we've set up the next panel well in terms of digging into some of these supply chain issues, but really appreciate your perspective and your wise advice for us as we continue to muddle through and think through really what I think we all want, which is how do we have a trade policy that works for everybody? So Ken, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, Orit. Thank you, Jeff, Chad. Pleasure to have you on for the first time. Hope to have both of you back. Ed, welcome back onto the WITC stage as well. Real pleasure to have all of you. Thank you.